to us and to all the people that are here in Brussels on the future of the euro with the name of Euro Tragedy. Ashoka, welcome back to Bruegel. Thank you for taking the time to come here and to discuss with us your views on the subject. Ashoka will talk about for 25 minutes with a presentation, and then our own director will comment on the book. But I would like to leave a little bit of time for many questions to come from the audience, given that, of course, that we all have views on the subject. Without any further ado, Ashoka, the floor is yours.
So let me first thank you very much. I have in the acknowledgements to the book created a special space for thanking Bruegel, and especially Guntram and Matt, who is hiding behind over there. They have hosted me for many summers and given me a very valuable platform to test my controversial ideas. And so I'm always delighted to be back over here. So the title of my book is Euro Tragedy. So you have a sense that this is going to be something of a gloomy talk. But let me try to persuade you that there's sort of a broad structural issues that I'm trying to deal with. So there are many in this room, and in a way I feel intimidated because you all perhaps know a lot more about the sort of details of what is currently happening than I do. But my goal is to sort of set the stage in terms of what the broad historical trends are and what political constraints it creates within which the Eurozone is acting. So I'm supposed to point where?
Just there on the... Yeah. The wrong button, just this one.
No, but how if I want to highlight something?
Oh, here, then on the screen.
Oh, I see. Okay, got it. Okay, that's fine. So there are, most of the slides have got pictures. So there are very few that have got words on them, and I know it's difficult to read the words. So I'm going to tell you what the basic story is. The basic story is that at the very inception, in the Werner Committee report, which is the original document within which the euro is set up, there was a clear understanding that a single monetary policy cannot work for divergent countries. And the thesis was, don't worry about it, because once we create a monetary union, an incomplete monetary union, we are going to ultimately have a process by which we will reach political unity. And so the phrase that the Werner Commission report uses is this one, that a single currency would act as a leaven for the development of political union. Another metaphor is falling forward from crisis to greater unity. So now what do I do? If I want to change the slide, I need to point there, and if I want to highlight, I point here. Okay, got it. The hard work of the book was to try to create a documentation that is contemporaneous. So a discipline that I followed in writing the book was never to look ahead and say what people said later or what happened later to try to second guess what they should have done at the time. So my entire emphasis is to say to you that even at the time, there were voices that were saying that this is not a good idea. Okay? So the first person who wrote a response was Nicky Calder. For those of you who know, Nicholas Calder was one of the great economists of the 20th century. And what he said is, the two phrases here are crucial. He said that not only would a single currency not work for different countries, it would amplify economic divergences. An interest rate would be too strong for Italy, that interest rate is too weak for Germany, and so it will increase the divergence rather than reducing it. And he then made a very fateful comment. What he said was, I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit confused here. What he said was that if as I expect, it creates economic divergence, it will create political divisions. That is a very crucial point that Calder makes right in March of 1971. He says that a house divided against itself cannot stand. There's a second theme, and that theme is attributed to Robert Marjolin, who, again, some of you in this room will know, was one of the most preeminent pro-Europeans of his time in the late 60s and early 70s. Marjolin said, the other problem with the euro is that there is a sovereignty barrier in Europe. That this idea that countries will give up their sovereignty, he said, is wishful thinking. He said, in fact, the nation state is reasserting itself, that the shadow of the war has gone and the nation state is reasserting itself. And he said, European leaders are obviously not ready to give up their core sovereign functions because the change required is too profound. So that is the setting. This is now we are in the middle, in the early to mid 70s. That's the debate. And so I fast forward to the euro, and I say, despite these warnings, a flawed euro was constructed. The French desperately wanted it. Kohl gave it to them on German terms. And there are two aspects of this that I want to highlight. One is that Kohl himself understood exactly the economics of the euro. He in a speech he once said, monetary union is like a bad speech you give on a Sunday, and you wake up and you get up on Monday morning and said, was I smoking something illegal? And Kohl understood that, but at some point he changes, and there's a long sort of history of why he changes. I'm going to skip over that. And in seeking the Bundestag's authorization on April 24th, 1998, Kohl defines the euro now in German terms. And he says twice to the Bundestag, I'm sorry, he says twice to the Bundestag, Germany will not pay the bills of other member countries. That is the German political contract. The German political contract in April of 1998, because of the extreme opposition within Germany to the single currency, could only be based on Chancellor Helmut Kohl's promise to the German people that Germany will not pay the bills for other countries. All the second guessing that is done afterwards that Germany should change requires that political contract to change. You cannot have a German chancellor change it without seeking the authorization of the German people. And Kohl had a third legacy which is very important, which is that he created a narrative. Because he understood the contradictions of the euro, he created a narrative, which is that the euro is an instrument for peace. It was a completely fallacious statement, because countries that share the same currency have civil wars with each other. Countries that do not share a currency do not necessarily go to war with each other. And so the idea that euro becomes an instrument for peace is completely outlandish. And if anything, as Calder said, it becomes the source of division and conflict. So my book says that as a consequence, because the euro was born in this crucible, there was no clear conception of where this is going to end up, because the vision of political unity that was outlined was at best a very fuzzy and hazy one. And there was no path to get to it. And so I use this expression for those of you who know who this is. This is Yogi Berra, who is a very well-known, American baseball player. And he's famous for sayings like, if you reach a fork in the road, take it. The future ain't what it used to be. And this is a saying, I think, of his, which is very appropriate. If you don't know where you're going, you end up someplace else. And that is sort of the theme of my book, that the Europeans who entered into the contract for the euro did not know where they were going, and so they've ended up someplace else. Okay, so I can then fast forward. the Calder prediction basically comes right, that the euro amplifies the divergence. And so I'm now in the post-crisis period. You see the divergence over here. It's a very stark divergence. You've seen these pictures. Germany begins to power ahead of France and Italy even before the crisis. That divergence gets amplified enormously. You see the same pattern in the unemployment. And a theme of my book is that when something like this happens, it doesn't reverse itself. In other words, the wounds in the course of an economic crisis leave scars which reduce the ability of a country that has fallen back to recover. Because the country that has fallen back has diminished investment, less R&D, people lose work experience and skills. So there's sort of what economists call a hysteresis effect, what I call economic scars that continue to hobble a country. You see this divergence in public debt. Already the North the South had higher public debt. That has increased. But the most stark thing, the one that struck me and that becomes part of my political discussion, is what is happening to the youth in the South. And you see that in Italy, something in the range of a quarter of Italian young people between the ages of 15 to 29 are either unemployed or they are out of activity, which means that they are not even registered to be unemployed. And so there is a huge despair amongst the youth in the South. And when they do get jobs, their jobs are very precarious on extremely short-term contracts. So this is the sort of soil within which the discontent with the euro then begins to increase. Okay. So one last sort of word, I'll just race through this slide. The divergence was predictable. It was not an accident, as I said. And the reason it was predictable is that there is a fundamental divide in between the North and South in governance and governance institutions. So this is the World Bank. These are World Bank numbers. You see, this is a measure. A larger bar is a measure of better governance in institutions. You see the South over here, and if anything has become worse, and you see the North, and this difference then translates into long-term growth prospects. So there are academic studies which show that if you use these measures to predict long-term growth prospects, those long-term growth prospects are better if governance and institutions are better. And so this is not a problem that you can solve through financial engineering. There's a long-term divergence in growth rates, and a single currency hobbles the weak and gives ability, and in some ways either does not influence or actually helps the stronger countries. So the divergence continues to increase. One last slide I will show you on the divergence is this slide. This is a very important slide for me. You see over here, this is R&D in 1997, this is R&D in 2016. This is where the South is. There's one exception here, France, which I'll talk about in a second. But they are essentially clustered in the 1 to 1.5% GDP range for 20 years. This is where the North is. This is where Sweden is. And this is where East Asia is. So we have an enormous gap. These countries cannot have low wages that are low enough to compete with Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, and they are not advanced enough to compete with mature advanced economies. So their long-term growth prospects are extraordinarily weak, and therefore when a shock hits them, they suffer disproportionately. And so this is another outcome of what happens is that Germany used to trade a lot with France and to some extent with Italy. The share of German exports to France and Italy has steadily gone down. And what is interesting is that the share to Czech Republic and Hungary and Poland, which are not in the Eurozone, has gone up. The big increase, of course, is China. And this slide has two sort of implications. One is the different economic trajectories on which these countries are operating, but also there was a view at one time that the euro would cause countries to trade more with each other. That was always an untenable proposition, and what drives this trade growth is essentially the prospects for trade. I'm going to just skip this target 2 balance chart because I want to just rush through this. So here is where Calder's ghost now really begins to haunt the Eurozone. Because Calder's prediction on the economics was not sort of brilliantly new. It was important but not brilliantly new. What Calder then said, which nobody at the time said, was this will also create political divisions. And so you see during the heart of the crisis, the country that begins to lose faith in Europe is Italy. And this is the moment, this is the height of the crisis in 2011 and 12, when Chancellor Merkel de facto becomes European Chancellor. She makes all the important decisions at that point. And I call this chart the dialectic because there was no other way to do it. The only person who could, in fact, do this was Chancellor Merkel. But by her very actions, she divided Europe. In Italy, her actions were seen as a diktat. And so you see at that very moment the growth of the five-star movement. In Germany, seeing the same actions, you see that a group of Germans begin to feel that she is doing too much for Europe. And so you see the growth of Alternative for Deutschland party. Grows the formation of AfD and the growth of Five Star are exactly historically contemporaneous. They begin in late 2012 and gather momentum in 2013. So the sense of an anti-Europeanism is born in the heart of the crisis because of the economic divergence that Calder predicted. So at this point, then I ask myself, the economics of the single currency are naturally divisive. Are there other forces that can somehow counteract them? And here, Marjolaine's ghost. So up until now, the Calder's ghost was talking. Here, Marjolaine's ghost talks. And remember what Marjolaine had said, that the nation state is alive and important and significant and will not fade away. In 1974, he said, the nation state is reasserting itself. And that reassertion, as the shadow of the war has receded, that reassertion, there was no reason for that reassertion to go away just because of the logic of the euro. In fact, if anything, the logic of the euro actually causes that reassertion to amplify. And so I first talk about what I call the myth of the Franco-German friendship. So a large part of the book is devoted to this idea that in the popular discourse, there is a very commonly held view that, well, France and Germany will come together, and once they decide, things will move forward. Even today, I see in the Financial Times an essay which says the Franco-German engine has started firing, and I say that so this chart is a textual analysis of all books digitized by Google. And I use this just to track the intellectual trends during this period. And they mirror very well the historical trends. So you see the notion of Franco-German friendship around the turn of the war. This is 1963, the Treaty of Friendship between Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer. And then the theme of friendship begins to fade away, and around Maastricht, the theme of a relationship begins to grow. And even that then begins to fade away. And the forces that you see over here in the crisis are important because there is such a gross imbalance in economic power between France and Germany that the notion that therefore there is some measure of equality which will then allow them to create a congruence of interest, on the contrary, amplifies the sense of national interest. And this is a chart from 2012, when now President Hollande is president. And he, as you may remember, is peddling this idea of Eurobonds. And there's a very cute story that I like to tell in the December 2012 European Council meeting. Herman von Rompuy brought up this idea of a European budget. And Merkel turns to him and says, and where will the money come from? And Hollande then very helpfully says, don't think of it as a European budget, think of it as a solidarity fund. And Merkel says, and where will the money come from? And this is not a new theme. This is a theme in the Bundestag in April of '98. When Kohl said Germany will not pay the bills for others, Merkel is essentially doing what Kohl promised in April of '98. To blame Merkel for not doing more is to ask her to go back to the German public after 20 years and say what Chancellor Helmut Kohl said to you, that Germany will not pay the bills for others, was wrong. A prosperous Europe is not just good for Europe, it's good in the German national interest. She has to fight a national election, not just create a fait accompli in a discussion with a new French president. She has to mobilize the German public to say, this is something we all need to do together. And no German chancellor has had the courage to do that. And so we have President Macron come in. This theme again reemerges. This is around Macron's election. This is higher frequency data, which shows again this theme of friendship appears. This is now the 55th anniversary of the Franco-German Friendship Treaty. And in my reading, nothing has changed. That all the discussions apart, the economic imbalance remains unchanged, and as long as the economic imbalance remains unchanged, the sense of national sovereignty will remain unless there is a very important political change that occurs within each nation first, before there is a European political change. So finally, I have one last theme on social democracy. Can social democrats play the role of creating a unified Europe through a sense of common values? And again, I report here something that's well known, that social democracy has been on a decline for many reasons. And the sort of intellectual laziness and exhaustion of the social democrats in Germany is in these tweets. So Martin Schulz tweets sometime, I think in early 2018, December 2017, where he says, well, we're going to create a European constitution. It's such a historical view. 2005, France and the Netherlands rejected the constitution with such overwhelming majority. And to suddenly say that that's sort of the solution for Europe is either being cynical or being completely naive. And you then have a German finance minister who says, it doesn't matter the party. Whatever the party, a German finance minister is first and foremost a German finance minister. And that is correct. Peer Steinbrück acted in exactly the same way as Olaf Scholz is acting. There's no difference, because a German finance minister a German political party does not have the courage to campaign on the basis of an obligation to Europe. Okay, I'm almost done. I just add one last set of slides which says that not only is Europe divided, it's also a declining continent. And a declining continent makes compromises harder. And so you see over here the share of world GDP. Germany increased in the late 19th century and then has been steadily on a decline. France began its decline in 1870. And this is in this period of decline, this is when the euro is consummated. And this is the crisis. You've seen these pictures before, of pictures like this before. You see that the United States recovered much faster than the euro area did. And not only did the US recover faster than the euro area, but did much better than it did during the Great Depression. The euro area did even poorly compared to the Great Depression. And this is my last picture that I want to show you. This slide that we have seen on in the past 100 years, the declining continent, that is set to increase. The pace of that decline is about to accelerate. And just focus for a minute, if you will, on these numbers. In 1995, this is the level of Korean patents in the US Patent Office, and this is Germany. It's 4 times the number. Today, this is where Korea is, and this is where Germany is. Look at France. France, although it does a lot of R&D, France has been essentially flat for 20 years. Look at where Italy is. If you compare Korea and Italy, Korea and Italy were identical in 1995. Look where Korea is, look where Italy is. And now you see the emergence of China. And I can almost guarantee you that in the next 20 years, this divergence will increase even more, because the East Asian nations are better educating their young, they're investing more in their future than the Europeans are. And the world will belong in the next 2 decades to those who are investing in their future on this massive scale. Therefore, a continent that is declining and divided makes it extremely hard to have compromises. And the euro in that context creates ties that bind too tightly. And there will be a crisis, and when the next crisis comes, the ability to handle the next crisis will be weaker. Europe is still rich, so it will get through 1 or 2 major crises like it has up until now. But if Italy has a crisis, as my book forecasts it will, then all bets are off at that point. So I end over here with I want to show you the cover of my book. I hope you will get a chance to see it. And the tragedy is that the warnings were sounded. And it need not have been. The euro came through a very narrow historical window. There was no good reason for the euro. It's a tragedy not in the sense that somebody was cynical or somebody was deliberately trying to undermine anybody, but at a very crucial moment in history, a set of people made mistakes, they were frail, and they created an outcome which is extremely hard to reverse. That is the euro tragedy.
Thank you very much, Ashoka. I think that the one thing that will certainly agree with you is that unless we ask some very uncomfortable questions, we will not be able to make progress. And you're asking a lot of very uncomfortable questions, which I think is very interesting and very useful. I hope that in the course of the discussion, we will be able to have your views also on what to do next. Because I think that would be an important thing. I mean, it's one thing identifying the cause, but the cure is also important. And certainly the crowd here will be very interested in hearing that. But before you do that, Guntram.
Well, let me start by thanking Ashoka for coming and for presenting his book. And of course, let me also say that the book is a wonderful book that I very much recommend reading. And as I think Maria just said, it asks a lot of, and it puts a lot of uncomfortable points out there. So look, I've been reading a lot of texts on the euro, but I think this is one of the texts which keeps me awake at night, right? Most texts don't keep me awake at night because I know the stuff, but here is a lot of sort of deep stuff to reflect on in there, and so I very much recommend everybody to read the book. Now, there's many issues on which one can comment, and I thought I will just sort of go through a few slides and sort of highlight a few points that I thought deserve more discussion. I don't agree with everything in the book, but I certainly do think that the book raises the right questions. So let me start with the euro, Kohl's euro. And I think here on the right you see a young person bringing down the Berlin Wall. You can guess who that young person is. But I think what it is a story about. Yes. So it is a story that essentially starts with German reunification, and where Kohl, of course, did think about and did realize that after German reunification, Germany would be too big and too small for Europe. It would be too big to dominate the continent, but too small to really lead it. And his view at the time was, the right approach is to be permanently bound in the euro and in a monetary union, and therefore eventually, be in this European setting, Germany bound in Europe as a guarantee for peace, as Ashoka also clearly explained the view. Now, his view of how things would evolve was probably not realistic, or perhaps he was also totally unrealistic in his views of how it would evolve. He expressed in 2011 his misgivings with the current German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. In one of his last interviews, he says, look, I mean, Angela Merkel doesn't have a compass and, doesn't go where I thought we should be going to. But in a sense, it was a bit of a disingenuous interview, in the sense that when the euro was founded, and Ashoka describes that quite well, Kohl never really accepted that conservative Germany didn't warm up to the idea of sharing fiscal sovereignty, and that the German conservative establishment actually never really liked the idea of sharing monetary sovereignty, and Kohl really pushed it through against the will of a lot of the conservatives in Germany. And basically the dilemma has been created at that stage, because as we all know, as economists, monetary and fiscal sovereignty are intrinsically linked and at some level become the same, because monetary and fiscal authorities are at some level just two arms of the same government. And so I think the intrinsic tension is there from the beginning, right? And so Kohl didn't really accept that and pushed through the euro against the will of large parts of the establishment, but promised them there would be no fiscal risk sharing whatsoever. And so I think this is basically the start, and where I think the book starts, and I think rightly so. I probably have little misgivings with what Ashoka is saying there. Now then, Ashoka talks a lot about the Italian fault line, and what I do here is I wonder whether the Italian fault line is primarily a result of the euro, or whether the euro just aggravates the issue. And my view here is, the view that I take here is that Italy has been in secular decline for decades. So this predates the euro membership. These are 10-year growth windows, real GDP per capita growth. And it's been going down significantly before the euro, and has not been a success story before the euro. So in a sense, I wouldn't blame the euro for a lot of the problems that Italy has now. There are major national political problems, bad justice system, education system, corruption, credit allocation problems, and so on. I mean, we all know this. And in all fairness, we should also say Italian employment now is higher than what it was in in 98, and the unemployment rate is actually lower now than it was in 98. So I think it's a bit too harsh to put so much emphasis here on the euro. I think there's very deep national problems. Now, having said that, once there is a problem, of course, it is a problem of the Eurozone, and the Eurozone monetary policy can only to an extent accommodate what would be needed to boost investment and so on in Italy. And, the political tensions in Italy are political tensions around basically the scope for fiscal policy in connection with the monetary policy space that is given to Italy. And so I think what the euro does is it constrains national policy making, fiscal policy making, in very severe terms. And it is against that citizens, of course, rebel. And I think that's, in a sense, the real issue. The real issue is not that a euro devaluation or something like this would dramatically help Italy. On the contrary, it is the fact that with your own currency, you basically control the deficit, and that allows you to solve some of your domestic distributional problems. So dropping out of the euro would make the country very much poorer, of course. I mean, but even, let's say, even if it hadn't been in the euro, I mean, devaluation basically makes you poorer, but it gives you some scope to solve some internal distributional issues, which currently have to be solved differently, and that's very difficult in a context where you basically have no growth. And so I think that's a bit the tragedy of Italy at this stage. Now, my third slide is on the euro area underperformance, which Ashoka basically confronts the data very much with the US. And I guess what I want to show here is that the story is really a story of 2008 to 13. I mean, since 2013, so since the recovery is ongoing in the Eurozone and the US actually perform quite similarly. I mean, so it's not that the Eurozone is doing dramatically worse. On the contrary, we are basically on the same growth trajectory. But in that critical period, 2008 to 13, we really do much worse than the Eurozone. And so let me zoom in a little bit on this period, which of course was the sort of the critical Eurozone period. I think there were severe monetary policy mistakes. Those could have happened without the euro. So I think bad decisions are being taken, and I would postulate that decisions such as the interest rate rise in 2011 had much more to do with ideology than with different views of different countries. I mean, the Eurozone as a whole was in a recession, and the chief economist at the time, Jürgen Stark, was just, I think, in severe misjudgment. So this is basically not a flaw of the euro, to my mind. Now, the second issue is the delayed and fragmented dealing with the banking problems. As you know, there were these things happen outside of monetary unions. I mean, we've seen the Japanese case where banking problems were resolved with severe delay, costing a lot to the Japanese society. But I would argue there was also some Eurozone dimension, and the Eurozone dimension here was that we were basically taking a decision, and Per Steinbrück with Merkel took that decision, that everybody will deal with this on its own, and that meant we never took a systemic approach to the Eurozone banking problems. And only resolved that really in a decision in 2012, where the banking union project started, which actually helps quite a bit, to my mind, in resolving some of the banking problems. The single supervisor is probably, together with the ESM, the single most important policy innovation that happened in the period of the crisis. Now, the third point is the absence of a lender of last resort. So this is really a design failure of the euro, and it was only resolved with OMT, and I think that was absolutely critical, OMT. But in the absence of the lender of last resort, we did have significant overreactions in financial markets, and therefore then also overreactions on the fiscal austerity side. So the consolidation in Italy, the fiscal austerity in Italy in 2011 and 2012, in many respects could have been avoided if, and the double dip therefore could have been avoided if the euro system had in place already a lender of last resort. So here is a design failure, but I think to a significant extent that has been addressed. Now there was a delay in quantitative easing, and there my main argument would be that it is actually also a design failure of the euro, because when the euro was conceived, we did not think QE would exist, right? And so the treaties and the way the ECB was set up and designed was not catering, we just didn't have the features to doing. We had to invent quantitative easing, and that took a long time. And the way it's done is a very peculiar way of doing quantitative easing. The ECB president now, and I show that in my next slide, says very clearly, well, this is now a standard tool, which of course depends on political support, but it is a standard tool which didn't exist, and we didn't know how to do it. And so I think they're indeed a design failure that was, I would say, largely addressed. Now, I talked about the excessive austerity in Italy and others, but I think to a significant extent that was a reaction to the significant overreaction in financial markets that then drove panicked political reactions driving austerity and contributing to the double dip. And of course, the absence of a euro area fiscal stance when monetary policy is at the zero low bound is a key issue. And it remains a design failure, and we basically have no way of dealing with this at this stage. The solutions that helped us get out of this, and since 2013 have a good recovery, depend essentially on the ECB. I mentioned Draghi was just re-emphasizing that quantitative easing remains part of the toolbox. OMT is and remains central. The banking supervision is at the ECB and has helped. And I would say also the BRRD and the Single Resolution Board and the fund do make a positive difference. I mean, they are not the end of the story, but at least we have made some significant progress here and have a better framework of dealing with banking problems than we had before, but we haven't finished this job, especially the deposit insurance hasn't been done. Now, I agree with Ashoka that the sovereignty issue still remains a crucial issue. The OMT ESM fix for this sovereignty issue is probably the only possible solution at this stage. It's a compromise that weaker countries find too restraining. There's an O missing, and the stronger countries find too generous. So I think that's probably a sign that it's a compromise. I guess the question now of going forward is whether the stronger countries will sort of fulfill Cold Stream, and perhaps it was not Cold Stream, I don't know, to move politically closer together, and weaker countries, whether they will address their deeper structural weaknesses. And I think that's especially Italy that we have to think about, because many of the other weaker countries have actually done quite a bit and have addressed a large part of their issues. For now, no willingness to shift is visible, and the euro area will therefore remain fragile. But to conclude, I would say it's a wonderful book focusing on the right issues. It's skeptical on many technical and administrative fixes, and rightly so. But I think Ashoka proposes a solution, and you didn't talk much about the solution, so we can discuss that a bit now, where countries should be let free, which I think is basically an illusion, as fiscal sovereignty in some of these countries is already lost. And so basically letting free ultimately means, to my mind, becomes inconsistent with Euro membership. And perhaps to sort of end on the more philosophical baseball quote, Europe ended someplace else. I think that's right, but I think history remains in the making, and the main responsibility, I think, at this stage remains, of course, more with the stronger countries who have the scope to act. And I think the stronger countries, in a sense, are seeing that with given all the external challenges that Ashoka describes, and that I think we have also many times emphasized. I mean, be it the R&D story, or be it the rise of China, but also more recently the breakdown of G7 and so on. I mean, all of these things certainly add to the balance of those forces that think, well, we actually need to fix some of these issues. And we should fix them, and we should move ahead. And so that's why I'm not totally pessimistic, and perhaps not quite as pessimistic as Ashoka is. But let's say the young teenager that was contributing to the breaking down of the wall is not that young anymore, but still tries to be a little bit optimistic about the future of Europe. And I think. We have made some significant progress, as I've shown on some of the issues, but some progress has not been achieved. And yes, you're right, on the fiscal, we have moved only a little bit through the OMT, basically. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have a few? It's okay, don't worry about the time. Can you...
I'm going to respond to at least a few points that Guntram made. Guntram, will you put back your slide, that 2008 to 13 slide? So the point, this is a more technical point, but I think it's very important to understand the difference over here. No, this slide, yeah. So, a theme of my book is policy wounds leave scars. Okay, so the economists call it hysteresis, and what I mean by scars is that if I have a trauma and I leave it untreated for an extended period of time, then that scar not only has sort of a temporary effect, it has a longer run effect. So. If my stomach has an injury, then the scar that forms in my stomach has a long-term effect in how my stomach functions. And economists call this process hysteresis. And every study shows that when a recession lasts too long, the recovery is weak. And so what Guntram is showing is exactly that. This is not an argument, Guntram, for saying that the euro area has done as well or can do as well as America. What this is saying is that even though for 5 years the eurozone fell back, it is now only growing at the same rate as America is. If there was a genuine recovery, the falling back would have been clawed back by a faster growth. And it is that faster growth that then has to be compared. If I fall, then if I don't bounce back, then I have permanently lost those 5 years of growth, and I have then also lost during that period investment, R&D, which create a long-term growth handicap. And remember, a lot of this comes from Germany. And so you take Germany out, the picture looks even worse than this. The more important sort of economic themes of your statement, and look, this now is a genuine open question. Okay, one way of saying it is there were a lot of policy mistakes, and there were design flaws. The policy mistakes, perhaps we can learn from them and not make them again. Some of the design flaws we've corrected. Therefore, if a crisis occurs in the future, we'll handle it better. So what I do on the ECB is I ask myself the question, what is the consistent behavior of the ECB? And I start in the recession of 2001. And already in 2001, the ECB is much tighter than the Federal Reserve in terms of the initial, the crisis that follows in the wake of the tech bubble. The ECB then remains too tight in the Great Recession. The July 7, 2011 interest rate hike, I consider the most catastrophic policy error made by anyone during the conduct of the Great Recession. The delay of the QE. The consistent pattern over here is that the ECB is not accountable to anyone. And because it is not accountable to anyone, it has the luxury of being hijacked by ideological and national interests. And so even if the learning has occurred, the question is, will it continue to be hijacked by ideological and national interests in the conduct of a future crisis? That is the principal question. As far as the QE is concerned, so President Mario Draghi announces that QE is being tapered, and then a few days later at Sintra he says, maybe not, maybe we can bring it back. That is historically exactly the wrong thing to do. The Japanese would do that. They would say, well, we don't really need it anymore. We will come back to it when we need it. If you do that, markets don't believe you. Markets don't believe you because they say, well, they stopped prematurely the first time. Why do we know that they will continue the next time? And so the lesson from QE, the big lesson from QE is that you have to do it big in a sustained way over a long period of time. The Americans did it from December 2008 to October 2015. The Japanese did not do it right and so suffered and fell into a deflation trap. The ECB brought it in too late and has withdrawn it way too early before the Italian inflation rate is something in the range of 0.5%. Italy is essentially in a low-flation trap. I'm not saying that the ECB can solve Italy's problem. That is the original sin of the single currency, that ECB cannot solve the problem. But to declare victory and say that the inflation problem is solved because German inflation is 1.6% and Italian inflation is 0.6% or 0.5%, that's not solving the problem. What all that does is it widens the real interest rate differentials across countries. The divergences continue. I'll say one last word, and then I want to stop because I do want to people to have opportunity to ask on OMT. So Guntram and I have had this discussion for many years, so he recognizes what I'm going to say. OMT is not a lender of last resort function. OMT is a conditional lending program. OMT is a sort of super IMF. What does that mean? A lender of last resort, a true lender of last resort, does not ask questions. So you need the money is here, and delivers the money on call. Because the lender of last resort's function is essentially that there's a liquidity problem. No matter what, my job is to correct the liquidity problem. What does the IMF do? IMF says, look, you guys, you've messed up for all these years. You need to get your house in order. Come to us, talk to us, spend 3 months, 6 months discussing a program. Let's agree on it. There's a battle. Sometimes it takes longer. Then there's a program. It's politically divisive. There's a program. That's exactly how the OMT Act works. For Italy to go into an OMT, for Italy to be eligible for OMT, it would need to first have a program with the ESM. That program, negotiating that program on the size that Italy would need, I don't know how long it will take. It could take months. So the idea that OMT is on tap and therefore there is a willingness for OMT to come in at any moment, I think that the beauty of the OMT is that it works beautifully if it's not called on to work. So the Irish bank guarantee, the Irish in 2008 said, don't worry, all banks, we will repay your creditors. And for about 3 days, it worked like magic. Everybody said the Irish sovereign is going to repay us, we don't need to worry. And then they said, oops, what if the Irish sovereign cannot pay us? And then it went to hell. Essentially, at that moment, the guarantee broke. The OMT is better positioned because the ECB can print money in the last call. But it's not the technical ability of the ECB that will be in question if the OMT is tested. It will be the political constraint within which the OMT is asked to be operated. And the question at that moment will be that if the ECB extends OMT to Italy based on a program which is imperfect, what if the Italians default? Who is going to bear those costs? That's going to be a political decision, not a technical decision. And so you always come back in the context of the euro to the fundamental fact that there is no political contract that envelops this operation. There is no political contract which says your interest is my long-term interest. Therefore, I'm the state of Connecticut in America, you're Alabama and Mississippi, I give you 5% of my GDP every year. I don't think about it. I don't wake up every morning saying to myself, oops, these Alabamans are taking my money away. I see it as part of my obligation, and some don't, that there are rich Americans and poor Americans, and I pay taxes so that some poorer Americans can benefit from that. I don't identify them by Alabama or West Virginia or Mississippi. That is the nature of a political contract. It is within that political contract that a fiscal and monetary system works. And so every device like OMT fundamentally always hits that sovereignty barrier. And so the question is, if there is a real crisis, will these instruments hold the test, the political test? And that is where we don't know the answers, and that is what we have to watch and see.
I mean, just to say, I don't disagree with that point. I mean, I think what it is a fix and an attempt to have a sort of political contract. And it is a temporary political contract. I mean, OMT is supported and was supported by the German Chancellor and was defended in the German public, including the finance ministry, against a lot of opposition to coming from members of parliament and so on. So there is sort of a first attempt of a political contract. Now, where it will go, we don't know. I think I entirely agree with you, and it certainly falls well short of a real joint treasury, which would be the more elegant solution. But it is an attempt to solve something that wasn't there before, and that has tremendously helped stabilize the situation. But I agree with you that, I mean, the long-term sustainability of this is very unclear and depends very much on the politics of the future. Perhaps the other quick point I wanted to react to is the political contract. And I think you're right. What is the political contract? I guess the point we should be fair about is that the political contract in our societies is questioned not just in Europe. I mean, this is, I think, a very far-reaching phenomenon that we are seeing. And you said quite easily, I'm ready to pay taxes in the US for a poor person somewhere else. Well, I'm wondering how many taxes are actually being paid for rich people in the US. I mean, so inequality and so on are much bigger issues. Now, what is issues than in Europe? But of course, you're right that perhaps there's a less of a state dimension. I mean, that's the difference. But the political contract of redistribution resources is being questioned everywhere in the West. I mean, so I think we have a much broader problem than just the Eurozone problem here. But perhaps you...
Yeah, well,
sorry.
I'm not going to comment on that because otherwise questions and then we can, yeah.
let's do it. Alicia, Francesco, let's collect the gentleman there. Alicia first, here.
Ashoka, first of all, thanks very much for this thoughtful account of what's happening in Europe. I must say that I don't disagree too much with your assessment in as far as what has gone wrong. However, I think there is an issue with the counterfactual in your presentation, meaning would Europe have been better without the euro? Because, it's easy to say things are not going very well, but how would they have gone without the euro? And if I read you correctly, it means at least less divergence. I don't know whether you will agree, you'll answer in a minute. But to me, the issue is not only divergence. It's really all about this secular decline, which is not only Europe, I'm afraid. It's the West. You said it very clearly. It might have been more accentuated in Europe more recently because maybe exactly this tightening of countries that were divergent. But on the other hand, the euro has also helped many of these countries. If you think of the country, I come from Spain. I mean, all of the internationalization of these corporates and banks was helped by the euro because they could finance themselves in a currency that they wouldn't have ever dreamed of. This is just one example. I could give you so many. So I think it's a little bit like twisted towards what is negative about the euro. I think the euro is an extremely useful tool, the more so if you didn't happen to have a strong currency. Let's face it.
Extremely useful tool for what?
To have corporates, banks that can diversify the risk away from their own economy. This is one which countries in Europe, which were stronger and richer, could do with a stronger currency, which we couldn't do. Now, the point is you need to get there. I mean, you need to be able to get there. And the issue to me is that getting there has nothing to do with the euro. So you showed, and you mentioned about education in Asia. I've been living in Asia for 13 years, so can't agree more. That has nothing to do with the euro. So to me, the structural problems that you are showing are more things that could be solved if we wanted to, independently on the currency. And I just wonder whether we shouldn't focus on that rather than, because we are here already. I mean, exactly your point. I mean, once you are there, think about the cost of undoing what you've done, yeah? I mean, I happen to have been calculating this cost for a bank in Spain a while ago, and I'm telling you, and it's not only for Spain, it's also for Germany, let's face it. You're a net creditor, yeah, of assets that one day could be, yeah, denominated in a very weak currency. So I'm sorry to say that this is of no interest to anybody. So once we're there, we like it or not, Now the thing is, what are the structural issues that will not stop the decline of the West, because this is not going to be stopped, but we could decelerate the decline. Yeah? We could try to reduce that wedge that you mentioned with Asia and with other regions that will unavoidably grow more than us. And the question is, by how much and how far are we declining? And I would include the US in this pack, I'm sorry to say. So the structural part is not only Europe. We can say we have our own additional issues, but many of the things you showed would not be different across regions, across individuals in the US. It's just that you're a nation. are we ready to be a nation? I guess everyone will say no. I'm sorry to hear that because I would love Europe to be a nation, but that's a different topic. But point is, a lot of these structural issues have nothing to do with the euro.
Let's collect questions. The gentleman just behind you, can you pass the microphone there? Yeah, if you.
Okay.
And then Francesco.
Yes, maybe a question
Can you
which
tell us who
is
you are?
yes, a question which is maybe linked to yours.
Can you?
Mihai Macovei, I work in the European Commission.
Thank you.
So, I also took from your presentation the decline in the productive structure of the southern countries of the Eurozone and the longer-term structural weakness. Do you think that if we move towards removing the flaws in the euro construction, i.e. lender of last resort, transfers, fiscal transfers, would this help these productivity and structural issues in the south or exacerbate them even further?
Okay, so this is more or less the question that actually... okay, so there are two questions here, Francesco and the gentleman. Yeah. We'll have a second round. Francesco here at the front.
Well, thank you very much, Francesco Mody from Brugge. I will start from the last slide of your presentation, the one with the cover. And in order to be convinced that you got the title right, that the euro is a tragedy, I would need to be convinced on three issues. One, I think Alicia has already mentioned. What is causality between the euro and all the problems that you identify? I don't see it. Maybe I see that your book is pretty thick. Maybe you devote many pages to explaining why the euro caused all those problems. I'm curious to read those pages because I find it very difficult to think that a monetary issue caused so many structural problems, as Alicia said. The second issue for which I would like to find an answer in your thick book is the euro, according to Eurobarometer, is supported by some 2/3 of the population in the euro area. So this is not a kind of small group of frail people 30 years ago. This is, according to Eurobarometer, a large majority of the people in the euro area. They don't share your view that the euro is a tragedy. How do you explain this difference of opinions between you and 70% of the euro area population? My third point is, it's a trivial statement, I'm sorry, that we have a common currency without a common state. The relevant question is, are we moving towards political union? Have we moved over the last 30 years to political union? Are we continue moving in that direction? That, to me, is a relevant question. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take the question here, just behind you, Francesco.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Mogni. I'm a former colleague of the European Commission, and I'm following very closely the evolution of the Italian economy being in Brussels. I fully agree with your assessment saying that the Italian problems are not entirely related to the euro. We have in Italy a problem of competitiveness, a problem of productivity, which dates back to the 70s and even the 80s. Very much related to the fact that the Italian industrial system is based upon very small SMEs, very reluctant to invest and very fragile, and traditionally very much assisted by central government through a number of different funds. So we need to see also the structure of the real economy in order to understand what are the weaknesses, the structural weaknesses of a country. Now, we have a new government in Italy with a social contract, with a program. In the past, the idea was to support the supply. To support the supply side, meaning supporting industries, companies, reducing taxation, and try to relaunch production and investment, research, etc., etc. This policy did not work entirely according to our initial estimations. Now the idea is to support demand. To support demand meaning, as you said, to support the purchasing power of people and also to increase the purchasing power of people. So we are talking about an internal, a demand-oriented economy, and not so much export-oriented economy. And this is why it is very important for the Italian government today to support essentially central Italy and southern Italy. which are not included in the Germanic or German economic cycle, as it is the case for the industry in northern Italy. So the idea is how to support the demand in the most fragile part of the country. Now, the euro. Is the euro the currency which may allow the regeneration of the Italian economy in central Italy and in southern Italy? I do not know, given that, of course, there we have the problem of competitiveness and the productivity. And also this high unemployment, as you have mentioned, particularly among the young people. What we did not estimate, what we did not foresee in 2001 when we introduced the euro, was the fact that China joined the WTO and China became, the big world competitor. Now, in southern Italy, the salaries of the young people are less than the salaries of the Chinese in Shanghai. So we have in southern Italy situations which are very much similar to the situations in Shanghai. But, once again, in Shanghai they work 40 or 50 hours a day. In southern Italy, they work much less, and you don't have the innovation, you don't have the push.
Okay.
Can the European budget support? Can Europe try to, through transfer of, financial transfers, etc., can support the reinvigoration of the economy in southern Italy, but also in other parts of the Mediterranean countries, which face the same problems?
There's one common thread in all the questions. Let me just set that to rest for right away, because otherwise it's going to make this discussion very hard. The fact that countries have long-term problems and cannot summon the political will to deal with their long-term problems is not due to the euro. That this book says many times. It recognizes that some of these long-term weaknesses are very much part of weaknesses in all advanced countries. It recognizes also that the same social divisions that we see in Europe today, with a group of people being left behind on the wrong side of globalization, is true certainly in the United States and well beyond the Eurozone in Europe. So the backdrop that there is a secular decline of advanced transatlantic countries, where the forces of globalization have a very unequal impact on countries, is very well recognized by this book. And no one is saying that decline in Europe is due to the euro. Okay? Just let's take that off the table. What does the euro do? The euro amplifies those problems. How does the euro amplify this problem? So take your Spanish example. What is the counterfactual for Spain? Spain would probably not have had the property bubble, very likely would not have had the property bubble it had without the euro. The property bubble in Spain is almost directly traceable to the cheap money that became available after the euro was formed in 2001, 2002, 2003. Therefore, the big growth and then the sharp fall, that is very much a product of the euro. The more serious problem of the euro is that at a moment a country is in crisis, it hobbles the country. It hobbles the country because a single monetary policy cannot help the crisis country to the same extent as it's helping the country is not in crisis. So take Italy. Italy is a very simple example. Between 1970 and 1999, the lira went from 200 lira to the Deutschmark to a peak of 1200 before settling somewhere around 1000. Essentially, the lira lost something of the order of 85 to 90% of its value. This is a period in which Italy has positive productivity growth. So even with positive productivity growth, declining but positive productivity growth, Italy needed the crutch of a depreciating lira. I'm not saying that this is the euro's fault, but what happens after the euro comes is that the euro was introduced on January 1st, 1999 at 1.18 to the dollar. Traded first in Sydney at 5 o'clock in the morning before European markets opened. The euro today is 1.16 or 1.17. The lira, which is effectively the euro, has remained unchanged for 20 years during a period within which Italians, for whatever reason of their own making, have grown at a negative productivity growth of 0.5%, 0.25% a year. So Italy is caught in a eurozone trap. It already has extremely low potential to grow. And it has a monetary policy that is always too tight for Italy. That is the counterfactual. What is the counterfactual? Suppose Italy had its lira. Suppose there had been no euro. What Trump said is exactly what would have happened. That the currency would have depreciated because the Italians would not have been able to get their act together. The currency would have depreciated by 70-80%. Italians would have become poorer. As they are becoming poorer, the big difference, and this is the crucial policy difference that arises, is that the Italian crisis would have been diffused little by little with every lira devaluation. So having spent almost 11 years at the IMF, having done some of these academic studies myself, a country that has a floating exchange rate does not, almost never has a financial crisis. Because this is Milton Friedman's 1953 insight. The exchange rate will depreciate, but exchange rate depreciation is not a crisis. It does not create a moment in which there is a panic, because the sudden stop problem arises only when there is a fixed exchange rate. And so Italy would have gradually become poorer, and Italy's problems would have been Italian problems. Today, because Italy is in the Eurozone and it's caught in this trap, Italy's problems are Europe's problems. And Italy's problems are Europe's problems, therefore potentially the world's problems. That is the difference. So, I'm not saying that the euro made it worse in some sense that educational systems in Italy would have been better, but for the euro. But I am saying that for a country that is already so unable to deal with its own domestic problems, it creates a further handicap, which then does not allow it the macroeconomic breathing space to grow out of its problems every time there is a crisis, which creates more scars, which lower potential growth for a longer period of time. That's sort of the general answer to the question. On the question, is there a movement towards political progress? The answer is no. The answer is, if anything, the divisions have become deeper, and those divisions will continue to become deeper. On the Eurobarometer, the particular survey that you're talking about is a sort of hokey survey. It sort of shows a flat 70% for the last so many years. I look at, even in the surveys, I look at what do people trust the ECB. I look at how people are voting in elections. That's what I look at, because that is to me a much better metric of the degree of anti-Europeanism or pro-Europeanism.
Okay, we have time for two more questions, but I'm hoping that you're going to give us the two advices that you want us to take away. What do we do next? Before the end of this, I would like you to give us an answer to that. So the questions, I think Andrea also had a question. Right? Okay, well, you have to make them very quick. So here first, and then Andrea, and then in the middle. Please, very quick questions so we can end on time.
Thank you very much. Martin Lach, European Fiscal Board. Now, I just have a comment on, I will call it the overall packaging or the assumed historical forces underlying your narrative. I have not read the book yet, so I can only rely on the presentation that you gave a minute ago. And in the presentation, to me, you gave the impression that the whole text of the drama had already been written in the 90s. Yeah. So it was, I totally disagree with this deterministic and deterministic view. Yeah. I think that the text has not been written, at least not the ninth act in the 1990s. I very much hope, and I'm convinced, that the text of this drama, or maybe even a comedy, is being written as we go on. Yeah. Now you have chosen a very prominent economist, Nicholas Caldo, as someone who sort of saw through the veil of the president and anticipated the demise of the euro. I'm sure, although I have not done the research, that there have been other, maybe less prominent pundits that anticipated a different outcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Andrea, and then two more questions here. Let's Andrea here, and then in the middle, and we'll stop it there.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, and also thanks to Guntram for the very nice comments. I haven't read the book either, but I want to take what you said very seriously, and in a sense, I want to take partly your side and debate with some of my economist colleagues and friends. I took from your presentation, which was a very political presentation.
Yeah.
I think that is indeed the way we need to look at this. And if I understand correctly what Guntram said when he said, this is keeping me awake at night, it's not because I suppose it's the economics that is keeping us awake at night, because indeed the economics, the people in the room here, they can solve that problem.
Quite right.
Okay, so we know how to solve the problem from a technical viewpoint. Okay, it's not so complicated at this stage, especially after all those crises. What is hard is indeed the political issue, and I think where I would agree with you, and that's where I disagree with economists, is this counterfactual. It's something that citizens do not care about and do not understand. This is only something that we economists understand, at least in part, the counterfactual nature of issues. And we want to, obviously, as economists, we want to make this analysis. And that is correct for us. But we cannot convince citizens that with or without it would be this and it would be that. Where I think I agree with you is that once we created an economic and monetary union, well, this is the title, then citizens are entitled to believe that indeed part of the issues that they are facing is a union problem. You can't anymore turn to say, well, this is an Italian problem. Sure, for us, it is economically, it is an Italian problem. But politically, it has become indeed, I agree, a union problem. And there, I think, is the issue that one needs to address. And this is where I think really we need to move forward, because nobody here believes, I don't know whether you believe that, I certainly don't, nobody believes that the next step is the demise of the euro. Yeah. So the worst scenario is continuing in this difficult position, right? Where one improves, but not enough not to have another crisis. Then there is a political response to the crisis, but it's not enough to avoid the next crisis, and we stay in this sort of bad equilibrium, which is not the demise of the euro, but it's not a very happy situation, right? And there's always the risk that things can get worse.
Yeah.
And that is not a good equilibrium. So I think what we need to discuss from a political viewpoint is what are the steps that are needed from, again, and feasible from a political viewpoint to go to a happier equilibrium. Not the perfect equilibrium, but a happier equilibrium, but that does take into account, indeed, I think what you put your finger rightly on, which is the political problem of this, not so much the economics.
Right.
Thank you much, Andre. Let's have the two last questions, and then Ashoka, you can have the last word.
Vettori from the Research Institute of Finnish Economy. Very many thanks for your presentation. You seem to emphasize that for a monetary union to function well, it needs to be accompanied by a fiscal union. You refer to Alabama as a U.S. state which benefits a great deal.
I mean that there has to be a political contract within which a fiscal union exists. In other words, not just a technical fiscal union, there has to be a political contract within which a political union.
But still, my understanding was that this fiscal risk sharing between the states is an important element of the functioning of the U.S. monetary union.
Yeah.
But how much empirical evidence there is in support of that? As far as I understand, most of the studies that have been done about the smoothing economic shocks between the member states, states in the U.S. Suggests that fiscal stabilization has been very small in comparison to what you have through capital markets and trade markets. So is that really an essential part of the story?
Yeah,
Thank you very much. And one at the back, that's the last one. You're already out of time.
Do you discuss in your book, okay, I highly appreciate your book, but I think it's too categorical. Do you have discussed also the history of the euro? When Nixon lifted the exchange rate
broke the Bretton Woods
yes,
agreement. Yeah.
that was a golden standard for Europe. After 2 years, Giscard and Schmidt created the snake.
Yeah, and that's where they made a mistake.
It failed 3 times.
Yeah.
The answer was either we go for one currency or we stop the whole thing.
Yeah.
They went for one currency. Okay, that theoretically, yeah. And the reason for that was simply that if there is no quiet point in the financial markets, the single market would collapse one day or another.
Yeah.
And have you imagined what would have happened if we would not have had a currency after 2008? The D-mark would have gone to sky's limit, the lira to hell, and the rest in between. Yeah? That would have meant probably the end of European integration.
Okay, so
But did you analyze that?
Yeah, so I did.
Sure.
So let me just go in reverse order. And then, because I will then be able to end with also your, what if any vision do I have for the future? The notion that a single market requires a currency. The notion that a single market requires a single currency is not a logical notion. Today, Germany is exporting much more to the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland than it does to France. No, sorry. So just let me finish now. Okay. The single currency. There was never any basis for the notion that a single currency is needed for a single market. And you see that in the data. You see that European nations are trading with countries that are growing fast, not with countries just because there is a single currency. As far as your question, sir, is concerned, your empirical observation is correct, and my explanation for that is that unless you have a fiscal union that is a public fiscal union, the private risk sharing is much harder. So the reason the Americans do a lot more private risk sharing is that there's an entity called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that stands behind with a big umbrella with the full faith and credit of the US sovereign. And within that umbrella, there is a complete reassurance to banks and others who are operating in the unified financial market that they can in fact risk share. That I can invest in Nevada even though the Nevadans are going crazy, because I have a way of diversifying my risks in what is a truly unified market. And you see in Europe, in the Eurozone, that even now inflation differentials persist over time. So there are inflation differentials even in the United States, but they last a very short period of time, they reconverge. But today you have Italy with 0.5% inflation, Germany with 1% inflation, and that inflation differential will persist because monetary policy is too tight for Italy and too loose for Germany. Therefore, that inflation differential does not re-equilibrate by any automatic cause. And so if you do not have a mechanism that unifies, then private risk sharing becomes very hard. And so therefore, I'm very sort of skeptical about initiatives like Capital Markets Union and so on, because they are sort of an overlay on a system that is not ready to there's no fertile soil there to absorb them. There was a third question before Andres. Sorry, your question was deterministic, right? Whether I was being deterministic. Yes, I am being deterministic. That is why I call this a tragedy. I say that the moment the euro was created, it unleashed a set of forces that are very hard to reverse. They're hard to reverse because the one success of the euro is that it's very hard to break. And as long as the euro remains, it will continue to amplify economic divergences across the eurozone. Ipso facto, that's not a question, that's not a debate, that is ipso facto. It says that a single monetary policy will not work for countries, it will hobble the weaker countries, and it will support the stronger countries.
Sorry, if you just may. The adjustment mechanism in the monetary union, outside monetary union, the only difference is that in one case you have adjustment by prices and the other way via wages. So I don't fully...
And the adjustment via wages is socially catastrophic. So don't shrug your shoulders. Let me pursue your example. So Italy to adjust by way of wages would require Italian wages to come down at least to Polish levels, if not to Romanian levels. And the question is whether the social contract in Italy will break as a consequence of that adjustment. There is a reason why countries have floating exchange rates, because of what I think Guntram called itself the internal distributional problem in the least sort of public and offensive way. It is also true that when there is a devaluation, there is a real wage reduction, as he's saying. But that is possible. But asking a factory worker in Turin to say, you're earning 1,000 euros a month, oops, you're going to get 500 euros a month from such and such a time, that's simply politically not possible.
And the pension adjustment.
Sorry?
And the pension adjustment. When you have a huge welfare state, you cannot support in the current circumstances. By getting the euro, Italy now needs to pay pensions in euros, real pensions every year.
Yeah.
Can they support the social burden?
Yeah, exactly.
Can you have a few last words?
So I think, Andres, well, thank you very much for your very kind comment. I think you're quite right that ultimately this is a political problem. So I tried to write a book that is not a policy manual because I wanted to write a history. Nevertheless, when I reach the end, here's what I say. I say within the current constraints of the euro, the policy objective has to be to loosen the ties that bind too tightly. And by that I mean I would get rid of the fiscal rules. I would get rid of the fiscal rules because they serve no economic purpose. They never have, they have they're economically illiterate and they're politically corrosive. And I do not accept a proposition that a bad rule is better than no rule. A bad rule is always worse than no rule. That is the proposition. Therefore, the fiscal rules have only a negative feature to them as far as I'm concerned. I believe that Chancellor Merkel at Deauville was correct, that there has to be a debt restructuring process within the Eurozone. I think the people who have taken from that episode that spreads rose because of that episode completely incorrectly read that history. I've spent a lot of time explaining why those facts are not right. There has to be a gradual process, but it has to be a meaningful process. And I described how that process can unfold. And the third is that the ECB must have a dual mandate. It must have a mandate to support employment as well as price stability. I go back to a paper by Franco-Mody in 1998, maybe you're one of the few people who may remember this, in which Modigliani in 1998 says that an ECB with an exclusive price stability mandate will always keep interest rates too high. Europe is a continent with very high unemployment and therefore will make the unemployment problem worse. Therefore, I recommend a policy that has a dual mandate, and I can say with great confidence that this will not compromise the price stability objective. So within the current constraints of the euro, those are the three things I would do. And here, again, I think we are saying the same thing. You're saying that it will probably muddle, but there could be a catastrophic crisis. And I see the potential of a catastrophic crisis, mainly in Italy, which I say is the fault line. And the numbers are very stark. Italy currently has a real interest rate of 2%, and its potential growth, it has a potential growth rate of 0.75%. That's not a sustainable situation. And so if world trade slows down, as I see it now slowing down, you could have, as early as the later part of 2018, a loss of confidence in Italy, in which case the spreads will increase, and given the size of Italy with its debt, terrible things could happen. At that point, I say that if it comes close to the point where there is an Italian exit is the only option, then Germany should exit the euro. There's only one safe way to break up the euro. Every way of breaking up the euro is painful, but there's only the least painful way is for Germany to exit the euro. Politically, I'm sure you will tell me it's politically not possible. And then the last thing I say in the book is that as long as you're muddling along, in your muddling along scenario, the emphasis should not be only on fixing the euro. The emphasis has to be on a mission to renew the well springs of growth. And unless the well springs of growth are renewed, and it's not just lip service paid to them, on a scale that is sort of sending man to the Mars scale, there has to be an effort to renew the educational infrastructure of this continent. You wrote this report with Philippe Agnon many years ago on the decline of European universities. That gap has widened. And so it is closing that gap that ultimately gives the buffers to deal with the shocks that the euro will inevitably create. That's sort of my sort of policy portmanteau for Europe.
Well, Ashoka, nobody will disagree with that, actually, the last point. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for a very interesting discussion, and I'm sorry to have kept you a long time. Please join me. Thank you. Good job.